John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown who terrified America, the man behind the clown mask. In 1902, in the city of Chicago, Illinois, John Wayne. Gacy was a familiar face in the community. He owned a small construction company, took part in charity work, and was well known for his role as Pogo the Clown at children's parties, hospitals, and charity events. Dressed in a colorful costume with a bizarre painted on smile, Gacy seemed like a harmless figure, a kind, cheerful, middle aged man always ready to help his community. But few knew that behind that makeup lurked a monster, a ruthless, cold blooded predator who harbored twisted desires for many years. He not only raped, but murdered dozens of young men. These boys vanished without a trace, while their families were left in despair, unable to understand what had happened. A dark childhood that sowed seeds of hatred. Born in 1942 in Chicago, Gacy grew up in a family that appeared respectable on the outside, but hid horrors few ever knew. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War II veteran, an alcoholic, authoritarian, and violent man. He beat Gacy and humiliated him, calling him weak and worthless. He was often whipped with a belt for minor mistakes, holding a knife in the wrong hand or crying when scolded. Gacy later recalled, I grew up with fear. I wanted my father's approval, but all I received was his blows. His mother was too frightened to intervene. In his childhood memories, Gacy both longed for affection and harbored deep resentment. This became the seed of a twisted psychology, a combination of shame, anger, and a craving for power, the lack of love, and the formation of a distorted personality. John Wayne Gacy's teenage years were a series of lonely and humiliating days. He was neither academically gifted nor athletically talented. His short, overweight, clumsy body made him the constant target of ridicule from classmates. He was mocked, given insulting nicknames, and had almost no real friends. As he grew older, Gacy began to realize he had homosexual desires, something that 1950s, 1960s American society considered sinful and shameful. Instead of trying to confront and accept it, he panicked and buried it deep inside. The guilt and shame, mixed with the fear of being despised, fueled a growing inner conflict. To cover up his weakness and inferiority, Gacy tried to compensate by appearing successful. He threw himself into work, joined civic organizations, engaged in politics and charity. He wanted to be recognized, to prove to his father and to society that he was not a failure. But it was all just a mask, the shadows of an abusive childhood, sexual identity shame, and his inability to control his urges simmered like an incurable disease. It crept along, growing slowly, waiting for the day it would erupt into a true monster. The first crime and the system's mistake. In 1968, Gacy was arrested in Iowa for luring and raping a 15-year-old boy. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. This should have been the point where the justice system protected the community. But after only 10 months, thanks to good behavior, Gacy was released. He moved back to Chicago and started a construction company. Free from his criminal past, Gacy worked to rebuild the image of a model citizen. But inside, his violent desires never went away. They only grew more extreme. Why did he choose to become the clown? Many people believe that Gacy put on the clown costume simply to make it easier to hide his crimes. But the truth was much more complicated. At first, dressing up as Pogo the Clown was just part of his plan to build the image of a kind, trustworthy citizen. Gacy attended community parties, visited children's hospitals to perform, and appeared at local charity events. In the eyes of neighbors and authorities, he was enthusiastic, friendly, and devoted to society. The clown suit, with its oversized painted smile, lowered everyone's guard. Who would suspect someone who volunteered to bring laughter to children? Who could imagine that behind the garish makeup lurked a bloodthirsty monster? But the most chilling part is that Gacy himself admitted he felt pleasure when becoming the clown. In the role of Pogo, he believed he was allowed to do anything without judgment. That costume was not just a disguise for society. It was a cloak of power that let him unleash the twisted darkness in his mind. He once said coldly, "When I'm the clown, I can do anything. Nobody's afraid of a clown." It was a statement that sent chills down the spines of even the most seasoned investigators. The hellish crawl space beneath an ordinary house. At 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, a house that looked completely ordinary with a neat lawn and an unremarkable facade, John Wayne Gacy quietly turned the place into a true hell. Shortly after moving in, he began digging a large crawl space beneath the floor. Under the guise of being a contractor, Gacy had no trouble modifying and concealing it himself. Each time he lured a new victim back to the house, the same cruel script played out again and again. He tied their hands, assaulted them, and then strangled them to death. Afterward, Gacy dragged the bodies down into the crawl space, burying them directly beneath the living room floor and covering them with quicklime to mask the odor and deter insects. Gradually, the crawl space became a mass grave holding the remains of dozens of young men, completely unnoticed. Yet by day, Gacy walked the streets with a smiling face. He kept working construction jobs, attending community parties, shaking hands with politicians, and participating in charity events. Whenever he was invited to pose for photos with officials, he was always eager. Why did no one suspect him? Because Gacy had built a perfect facade, a successful business owner, a model citizen, and a charity clown. In everyone's eyes, he was the good-natured man always willing to lend a hand. No one imagined that right beneath their feet, he was hiding the brutally stolen lives of dozens of young men. Why did he kill so many and never stop? John Wayne Gacy did not kill for money or revenge. He didn't rob his victims or punish them. His motives were deeper, darker than any justification could explain. A craven for absolute power since childhood, Gacy had been beaten and humiliated by his father, growing up with a profound sense of worthlessness and weakness. Every time he strangled a victim, he felt that in those fleeting moments he possessed the power he had always longed for, the power to decide between life and death. In the act of squeezing the breath out of someone, he was no longer the timid child or the failure. He became the most powerful person in the room, the satisfaction of twisted desires. He didn't just kill, he raped his victims, often while they were bound or handcuffed. He called it a game, but in reality it was brutal sexual violence. After he was done, he killed them to silence them, to ensure no one could ever accuse him. Over time, his crimes grew bolder and more frequent because the need for control and perverse gratification became an addiction he couldn't escape, addicted to feeling above the law. Each time he fooled the police or convinced the community that he was a good man, he became more convinced of his own invisibility. He began to believe he was smarter than everyone else, that he would never be caught. That delusion of invincibility propelled Gacy into an endless cycle of murder until he finally became so confident that he spoke his horrific confession out loud. The last victim, Anna Shockin investigation, on December 11, 1978, Robert Peast, a 15-year-old boy, disappeared after finishing a shift at the pharmacy where he worked. That day, Gacy had stopped by to discuss a remodeling contract and promised to interview Robert for a high-paying job. Robert told his mother he would step outside to meet the contractor for just a moment and would be right back, but he never returned. Unlike the earlier victims, Robert's family did not sit back and wait. His mother relentlessly called the police and pushed them to investigate thoroughly. Detective Joseph Kozenchak, who took charge of the case, sensed that this was no ordinary missing person. He immediately placed Gacy under suspicion. Police obtained a warrant for a preliminary search of Gacy's house. Though they didn't find a body, they uncovered numerous disturbing signs: a pair of handcuffs tossed among his tools, sacks of quicklime, commonly used to mask the odor of decomposing bodies, various personal items and IDs belonging to young men who had previously been reported missing, and most importantly, a strange foul smell rising from beneath the floor. Realizing they needed more evidence, police decided to keep Gacy under constant surveillance. Under the pressure of being watched day and night and fearing arrest, Gacy began to unravel. He drank heavily and started rambling incoherently. Finally, in a drunken stupor one night, he uttered a chilling confession. "I've killed over 30 of them. I don't even remember how many." That sentence marked the beginning of the exposure of one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American criminal history. The crawl space is excavated. When Gacy's gruesome confession was confirmed, the court swiftly approved a full search warrant for the house at 8115 West Summerdale Avenue. Immediately, a forensic investigation team began dismantling the floor to inspect the crawl space they suspected was hiding bodies. What they uncovered surpassed all the horror they had ever witnessed. As layers of earth were shoveled away, human bones emerged from the mud. Torn clothing and decomposing corpses tangled together. The stench of death was so overwhelming that many officers had to wear masks or step outside to breathe before continuing their work. Day after day, dozens of reporters and news vans crowded the entire street. Each morning, live broadcasts showed images no one could forget: stretcher after stretcher, draped in black tarp, being carried out of what had looked like an ordinary home. The community of Chicago and all of America was stunned when the final count was announced. 29 bodies were found buried right beneath the living room and hallway. They lay heaped together in small pits that Gacy had dug himself over the years. And it didn't stop there. Gacy also admitted he had dumped 4 more victims' bodies into the Des Plaines River to dispose of them when the crawl space became too crowded. Those corpses, recovered later downstream, completed the monstrous picture of his crimes, turning the house into the most brutal mass grave in modern American criminal history. The historic trial and the sentence. In February 1980, the court in Chicago officially opened the trial of John Wayne Gacy. It was considered one of the largest and most shocking criminal trials in American history, drawing hundreds of journalists, reporters, and countless members of the public who came to watch. The prosecution prepared an enormous body of evidence to secure a conviction. They presented the jury with dozens of exhibits collected from Gacy's house: handcuffs, ligatures, sacks of quicklime, the victim's personal documents, and detailed photographs of the body excavation process. They also called witnesses who had been lucky enough to survive after Gacy lured them into his home and attacked them. Additionally, psychiatric experts were brought in to analyze records and demonstrate that Gacy was fully aware of his actions and not acting out of control due to any mental illness. The defense argued that Gacy suffered from multiple personality disorder and lacked the capacity to be held criminally responsible. But the prosecution countered with a sharp argument. All of his crimes were meticulously planned and concealed over many years, something inconsistent with someone incapable of understanding reality. After exactly 5 weeks of trial, the jury did not take long to reach a final decision. They declared John Wayne Gacy guilty of first-degree murder of 33 innocent victims. A sentence of death by lethal injection was handed down, bringing to a close a case so shocking that America would never forget it. 14 years behind bars. After the death sentence was handed down, John Wayne Gacy spent nearly 14 years waiting behind bars in Stateville Correctional Center. During that long period, he remained indifferent, never once publicly expressing remorse to the victims' families or to society. One of the most controversial aspects was that Gacy began painting in prison, especially self-portraits depicting himself as Pogo the Clown. These bizarre works were sold to collectors for high prices, sparking public outrage that his crimes were becoming a source of profit. Many victims' families demanded that all the paintings be destroyed, refusing to let them exist as sick souvenirs. Throughout the years awaiting execution, Gacy continued to insist he was innocent or claimed that others were involved. He never sincerely bowed his head to admit his guilt. On the day of execution, May 10th, 1994, when asked if he had any last words, Gacy coldly muttered a short sentence, "Kiss my ass." That was his final statement, a display of defiance and contempt for the law to the very end. After the lethal injection, John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. His body was cremated, closing the darkest chapter in the history of American serial crime. But the nightmare of the killer clown has never disappeared. Why did society allow him to exist for so long? The case of John Wayne Gacy was not only a tragedy for more than 30 victims' families, but also a stark exposure of serious flaws in society and the justice system. First, it was precisely because the laws at the time were too lenient that he was able to continue committing crimes. Even though he had already been convicted of raping a minor, Gacy spent less than 2 years in prison. If the original sentence had been enforced strictly, dozens of lives might never have been stolen. Second, the case also proved how easily communities can be deceived by appearances. Almost no one suspected that the cheerful man in clown makeup who handed out charity gifts was actually a cold-blooded killer. His image as a model citizen and a charitable clown lulled neighbors, police, and even local officials into complacency. Finally, the greatest heartbreak was that many victims' families were not heard early enough. In numerous disappearances, relatives contacted police from the very first days, but because most of the victims were drifters or part-time laborers, their families' pleas were often dismissed. That indifference inadvertently allowed Gacy to prolong his crimes for years. All of this is a bitter reminder. Not every murderer is easy to recognize, and society must remain vigilant, fair, and resolute in protecting those who are most vulnerable. The final message. When we look back on the entire horrifying story of John Wayne Gacy, none of us can help but wonder what turned a child who once desperately longed for his father's love into the most cold-blooded killer in American history. If his childhood hadn't been filled with beatings and humiliation, would the hatred and shame have grown so large that they swallowed his humanity? If society back then hadn't been so harsh and judgmental about sexual orientation, would he have had the courage to face himself instead of burying everything in the darkest corners of his mind? And if the police had listened to the victims' families from the very first disappearances, how many lives could have been saved from that hellish crawl space? We will never have definitive answers. But one thing is clear. Gacy exploited the community's indifference and complacency to maintain his respectable mask and hide his crimes for years. It is a painful lesson that no one is truly safe simply because a killer appears friendly and trustworthy. Sometimes the very people praised as model citizens can turn out to be monsters in disguise. If you believe this story deserves to be known by more people, don't forget to share the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's uncover the terrifying truths of true crime history together, so no one else has to pay with their life for misplaced trust and silence.